Yeah, and thanks to all of you for pulling yourselves away from the dessert break. Appreciate you being here. So as Tom mentioned, I work at Cisco. I'm part of our DevNet team. And what that team does is we really engage with developers outside of Cisco to help them understand the APIs that our platforms and products offer and how they can build on top of those to create their own solutions and integrate, with those products and platforms. And within that kind of broad team, I focus primarily on things related to open source and to standards. So areas where Cisco is contributing significantly to standards or to open source projects, and then using them within our products and solutions, or adding support for those standards into our products and solutions. Those subjects are both very near and dear to my heart, and I guess what I've seen in my use with them is that it's often very valuable to use the two in combination, and they can really benefit each other. And that's what I'm here to share with you, some thoughts on that today. Okay, so first of all, why standards? And how many of you are network operators? Okay, so that's what I figured, so good. So you probably already have a fair appreciation for standards, right? Standards hopefully are making your life easier. You really demand that of vendors, right? Because you want to be able to mix and match equipment from different vendors. You don't want to get locked into any one vendor. So these things this has been very important to you all along, and you've kind of demanded it. And then for vendors, they've participated in these standards organizations and efforts willingly because it opens up the markets to them. And it's also good for them because oftentimes they'll go into a situation where it's important for their equipment to work with that of a partner or even a competitor because there's mixed equipment in there. And so it really helps with interoperability, which is helpful to them as well. So then why open source? And I think especially in the networking area, open source has become important maybe more recently. More like in the last 3 to 5 years with a lot of very important open source networking projects coming about. And so much so that now you're really demanding that vendors have a story around open source. And so that's really, you're leading the way there too because it's important to you. If a vendor wants to be able to just have a seat at the table to talk with you about a solution, it's important that they know what's available in the open source area, because even though the whole solution won't be built necessarily on top of open source, there could be parts of it that are. And they need to be knowledgeable and they need to be active in those areas for you to really have confidence to go with them. Open source can be used in different ways. And so one way I say is being used defensively. And what do I mean by that? If you take an industry that has been based on standards, and we have all these powerful and well-adopted and used networking standards, then adding support for those same standards into emerging open source projects is very valuable, right? Because then it ensures that your equipment that supports these standards can therefore interoperate well with these new open source based offerings. Open source can also be used more offensively, and what I mean here is let's say there's an area where you don't really have a strong product offering, a competitor perhaps does. You could go in and come up with an open source offering, contribute to that, and sort of change the playing field so that you commoditize what was being done by that product offering, and now there's an open source alternative that does it pretty well. And so you can shift the game away to something that's more in your strengths. So now jumping back to the standards, and what I have up here is sort of the some thoughts about the traditional standards process. It has worked quite well, but there are some problems with it. First of all, even in the good case, it usually takes on order of years for a standard from start to finish to get defined. And then once it is defined, then there's time to implement it in your products. And then just because two different or different vendors implemented this standard, as you probably all know, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, interoperate well, right? And why is that? Well, I mean, standards are complex, implementations are complex. There's ambiguities in the standards. Companies implement different subsets of those. So it takes even more time then for interoperability to really be achieved. And eventually it is achieved, and then life is good. So this is what we've been living with, and it works, but it does involve a lot of time. So now with open source, what we're seeing is rapid transformations are possible with open source. Open source brings a speed and a collaborative spirit that really enables rapid change beyond the timescales that were possible with standards. And in some cases, what we're seeing is that an open source project will come out and get widely adopted and deployed and actually become a bit of a de facto standard even, while we're waiting for the regular standards to be defined. Whoops. Sorry, I went forward a bit too much. Okay. Okay, thank you. But there are some problems with open source too. For those of you who have delved into trying to use some of these open source projects and products, they're generally not as straightforward to start using. There is some assembly acquired. If there is documentation, you're lucky. And then oftentimes that documentation won't necessarily be up to date, and it's hard for you to figure that out. And there's good reason for this. It just makes sense. If you think about developers working on these open source projects, they'd much rather be creating new functionality, working on the code than writing documentation. So the documentation often does lag behind a bit. Also, even in the case where you have a product or an open source project that is very well documented, the problem is that no one open source project is going to provide a solution, the complete solution for you. So what you're going to have to do is pick different projects and mix them together, and those projects weren't necessarily designed to work well together. So that could be really challenging for you or for our system integrator then that's trying to build a complete solution out of open source components. So one thing that could help there though is if there were some common standards between, and then you could get the open source to work, have some shared commonality. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. What I put up here, I don't want to go through every single category. Basically what I did was I looked at relative strengths and weaknesses of open source and of standards. And you could debate any of these, or some of them are more obvious than others. The speed and time to market, I don't think anyone would argue with that. It's quite obvious that open source is quicker to get going there. But like if you look at accuracy, I think that's one that's a little bit more interesting to look at, because you typically think of standards as being very accurate, right? Because we spend a lot of time focusing on the details. And that's true, but open source, on the other hand, has the advantage of being iterative, right? So people are implementing, they're trying things out, they're finding bugs, they're going back and fixing them. So I'd say, there's really a trade-off there. Open source can be quite accurate as well. So if there's time at the end, I'd be happy to go through and kind of look at each of these in more detail and argue about the way I've categorized them. But in the interest of time, I think I'm going to move forward. But just hopefully it suffices to show that there's relative strengths of standards and relative strengths of open source and weaknesses of each too. So really we want to look for something more than just going entirely with one or entirely of other. And I think this combination of them is really the sweet spot. So then looking at that, what I'm advocating is combining open source with standards. And the idea being here, adding support for key standards into open source projects. To really look at coming up with reference implementations in open source that provide implementations of those standards as you're defining them. And a couple different ways that we've been going about doing that is through hackathons and interoperability events. So now one example where I think things are working out fairly well is I'm taking an example of an open source project, Open Daylight. How many of you are familiar with Open Daylight? Oh, great. Okay, so a lot of you. Open source SDN controller. I actually gave a talk on it at 2 nanogs ago. And don't worry about not being able to read all the boxes there. That's not really the point. Suffice it to say that at the top, you basically have the northbound APIs that it supports. In the middle is all the different networking functionality. And then at the bottom, you have all these different plugins to speak different networking protocols to interface to a variety of different network components. Now, what I just lit up in green, those are, because I'm active in IETF, I just looked at IETF standards that are supported in Open Daylight. And so these components that are in green are ones that are directly related to support of IETF standards. And you could probably make more boxes green, but I think there's enough there to at least get my point across that there's a lot of IETF standards supported in Open Daylight. And that's what makes Open Daylight really good for working with not just new networks, but with legacy networks, especially if you look at the bottom at the various networking protocols that are supported by Open Daylight. The fact that it supports all of those makes it a lot easier for you to take it and use it in combination with your existing networks and with existing equipment from other vendors. So I mentioned IETF. Now I want to take a closer look at IETF. And I'm not even going to ask because I know you're all familiar with IETF. It's been around for over 30 years, really defining all the key internet protocols and also most of the networking protocols that we all rely on. I listed some of them there. The one thing I want to point out is the mantra of the IETF I have listed there. It says, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And even this tagline it gives you the idea, or it helps illustrate why this blending of open source with standards, that the IETF lends itself very well to that, because the IETF already has a lot of the characteristics, I would say, of an open source community, so it made introducing open source there a lot easier, as it was already kind of a part of the IETF DNA. The problem within the IETF is that when it first started, I would say there was a lot of emphasis on implementations and running code, but as the years went on, it kind of shifted away from that, and much more emphasis being spent almost entirely on this rough consensus part. And as a result of that, things were slowing down. The quality of some of the standards was getting worse because you weren't having implementations to back them up. The community was aging a bit because a lot of young people coming out of universities and developers, they didn't find, they found it hard or maybe not interesting to participate in IETF. So they were avoiding it. So it was the same people just arguing over standards year after year after year. Still getting things done, but things were slowing down. So the thought was, well, let's bring hackathons into IETF. Let's get people coding at IETF meetings. Let's get them implementing the standards as they're defining them, as the standards are evolving. Let's put things into code, and let's flesh out problems early. Let's find ambiguities in specs. Let's feed that back in to what the working groups are doing to try to have the spec actually evolve more quickly. And then at the same time, be producing usable code. So if you are a developer, rather than having to go and read a spec, you could go and actually just take that code and start using it and improving it and integrating it into what you're doing. You're now creating something which is much more usable by the developer community. And you can get it out into people's hands much more quickly than just the RFC itself. Another important aspect was trying to attract new people, young people, developers into the IETF, get them involved, let them start contributing, because for them it's much more interesting and much more straightforward for them to work on code and to contribute that way than to follow the mailing list and read the spec and comment on that. Also wanted to point out, because not all hackathons are the same, I think the one that was done here was also very friendly and collaborative, and certainly the IETF hackathons are very collaborative. It's about sharing information, coming together to work on common problems and to move the state of the standards forward. And so a big part of it is people from the IETF who know the standards very well, engaging with people from open source communities and working together very closely. So we have some friendly competition there, but it's really more of a collaborative team building event and moving things forward that way. The first hackathon was done back at IETF 92. It's a little over 3 years ago. And at the time, I thought it was great because I managed to get almost 50 people there. And I thought, wow, this is, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do that. And the feedback from them was very positive. And kind of more people were getting interested in what we were doing as the hackathon went on. And then what was really important was that the participants in the hackathon took what they did and then brought that back into their working group sessions and provided some valuable input that way. So then what ended up happening was at the next IETF meeting, IETF 93, things really exploded. We had over 100 people participate that time. And at that point I knew, well, hey, we're on to something good here. This is really, there was a pent-up demand, and now the hackathon is kind of feeding that. And we were seeing great results in the working group sessions that happened afterwards. So we've continued to have it. It's now the hackathon's just a regular part of the IETF meeting. It happens the weekend before the IETF. And at this last one, we had over 250 people there. And when you think of the entire meeting only having maybe 1,000 to 1,200, that's a pretty large percentage of the people participating in the hackathon in one way or another. I also wanted to mention this, that we're using GitHub, not just for the hackathon, and that's what I'm illustrating here. We have a GitHub organization for the IETF, labeled IETF Hackathon. What that is just a place where we can host projects so that people can work on it together. But maybe the bigger shift here is the IETF even embracing GitHub in general, just because that's where the developers are. That's the way that they work on code. And so the IETF has always made all of its own tools, which has been really useful and served the IETF well, and has a great suite of tools. But in order to engage with the developers, you need to go where they are and use the tools that they use. So we're using GitHub not only for the hackathons, but it's even being used to some extent by working groups to work on internet drafts. Just because, again, for young people and developers, they tend to be more comfortable with GitHub. And so we're finding some good benefits out of that, and it's a continuing, I'd say, experiment within the IETF. Okay, now I want to illustrate this. This is an example of extending the reach, I would say, of the IETF work by using hackathons as a mechanism to engage with standards. There's a group within ISOC that has been trying to help get more engagement in Africa with IETF and with internet standards, and that's been difficult. One of the things we did, though, was we took this idea of the IETF hackathon and we brought it to India, and we did it as part of an African Internet Summit. And so then what we did was we let people in the local area engage with the IETF, not just through specs and reading them and commenting, but actually, again, through code, which for these people was much more natural, and they were able to contribute effectively and then provide their comments as a result of what they learned, as trying to implement some of these specifications and use them. So that was tremendously valuable. Okay, now I wanted to shift to a different standards organization, MEF. So this one, maybe not as many of you are familiar with. Who's familiar with MEF? Oh, great, still a very large number. Used to be known as Metro Ethernet Forum, now just really known as MEF. Basically created a name for itself by defining the standards around carrier Ethernet and really establishing that carrier Ethernet market in the service provider space primarily, and how vendor equipment can, to certify what vendor equipment needs to do to provide carrier Ethernet services. Now, that was basically a done deal, so now MEF is looking to go up the stack and define network services more broadly and network service orchestration, and so a set of standards around that. And Fortunately, MEF is noticing that developers are very important here as well, and that open source code is very important to this effort. So what I'm showing here is on the left-hand side, that's what MEF was as of just a few years ago. Basically 2 committees, a services committee that define the standards, and a certification committee that basically certified whether or not you were implementing those standards. Now if you look at MEF, there's 2 other areas where MEF is, 2 other parts of MEF. One is defining APIs, the LSO API committee. And so MEF really realizing that code is important, that APIs are important. So not just defining requirements, but actually defining APIs too for how one service provider can interact with another. So east-west type of APIs, and then also north-south going up and down the stack, defining APIs at each of these interface reference points. Also, there's a committee focused on community, and this is where the open source components really come in, and trying to get more people implementing the standards and using the APIs and doing that in parallel with defining them. Again, so that it's not like a multi-year effort just to define the standards in this space. Rather, we start to implement them as we're defining them and start using them and then iteratively make them better. So then similarly, we brought the concept of a hackathon to MEF and did something there to try to flesh out, what we were doing in terms of standardizing interfaces there, to use these APIs and see if they're sufficient, see if they're expressive enough, if we're able to actually interface it the way we need to be able to, see if they're complete, see if there's things that are missing, and if so, then add them in. So rather than wait until we have a completely kind of ratified API or spec, we're actually implementing it and feeding that back in. Another big part here was by shifting to code, that was a way to work collaboratively with the open source communities and with other SDOs. Now, one tricky thing that I wanted to point out here is that MEF is not as open as IETF, at least it wasn't. It's getting more open, but the way MEF operated just a couple years ago was you had to be a paying member in order to see any of the works in progress. All you could see were the specs once they were done. Now, obviously, that's going to make it very difficult to have something like a hackathon, right? If I don't even let you see the APIs or see the spec because they're not done yet, how are you going to start coding them? How are you going to start implementing them? So MEF has been really changing itself a lot and becoming much more open with its works in progress, and seeing a lot of benefit from that. So I think you're going to see more and more of that. Not only do you have the hackathons that are producing code related to the specs, but then MEF has even taken it one step further with having what they call MEFnet. And what that is just a cloud-based offering that we can use not only in the context of the hackathons, but imagine you have some code, you write a client, you write a server. Now we can have those things up and running and have kind of an interoperability environment that lasts not just during the hackathon, but it's perpetually up. And so it just makes it easier for people from different companies and from different open source projects to come together and have a shared kind of network and a shared space where they can work on things together and then have them up and running day after day. So that's been very helpful for the iterative development. So really, my takeaway that I hope you get from this is that there's good reason to combine open source and standards. I don't think either one is perfect in and of itself. I don't think either one is evil either. And by bringing the two together and using them in combination, I think you really bring benefit to both. By implementing the standards that are important to you and that you use all the time and getting those supported in open source projects, you make it much easier then to use those open source projects within solutions. And the great thing about open source is if there's something that's important to you and it's not implemented there, you can help influence getting it implemented. if you're not a developer yourself, maybe there's someone at your company or someone you can work with to get that added. The other thing is, from the open source community, it's very important for them to support these standards as well, because then it makes the open source networking products that they're working on much more usable by all of you. So it's really a win-win. And what we're trying to do here is to have each community see the value of each other and to take advantage of that. So with the time I have left, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Doug Montgomery, NIST. I was wondering where you would characterize open daylight on the documentation spectrum.
So open daylight on the documentation spectrum, getting better. Actually, there's a lot going on within open daylight within the documentation team to make it a couple things. One is to have more sort of uniformity from one, kind of from one project, one component of open daylight to the next. So kind of sharing the same sort of templates, the same way of doing things. The other thing is making it easier for people to contribute to the documentation, even if they aren't a developer. For example, it's a little bit difficult to get an environment in which you can build open daylight yourself. It's hard to figure out how to use all the tools and processes. So what the open daylight community is doing is to make a different path for contributing to docs than contributing to the code. So it's a little bit more straightforward for a non-developer to actually contribute to the docs.
So maybe a way to promote the synergy is to think about, producing things that look like informational drafts about API standards. Because certainly we're trying to prototype some IETF protocols in open daylight and are continuously frustrated by the API evolution of open daylight, which seems reasonably opaque to an average user. I don't know if there's an insiders club that somehow tracks that, but well, version to version of open daylight, seems like a brutal API transition to us.
Okay, specific APIs in it, or because like a lot of the APIs that Open Daylight offers are based on Yang models. So to the extent that the Yang models are evolving, its APIs will be evolving, but it sounds like you're referring to different APIs.
Well, thinking about this idea of having specific documentation, especially about APIs, that sort of checkpoints at major revisions in a document form, right? So it's not necessarily reading code, can sort of facilitate this, synergy between standards developers and the open source community.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so, the good news is it's getting better. It's not as bad as it used to be.
Lee Howard, Rutevia. Hey, Charles.
Hi.
Can you go back to your comparison chart, the bar chart showing open source and open standard?
Went through it quite quickly.
Because I was confused about the thumbs up and thumbs down and wondering if maybe they were reversed. Because it looked to me like you were saying that open source is fast and therefore that's bad, or am I misreading this? The time to market is long for open source and that's bad, or is it's better in open source?
Oh, that's a good question.
Good. I'm so glad that's a good question.
Yeah. I think those things are swapped around.
Okay.
Yeah, they are. Thank you. Hey, someone looked at my slides. Hey.
And there are lots
it's a new slide.
And I like it. I actually think it's a really interesting comparison. And actually, I'm very interested in Doug's point about documentation and how we can facilitate that. I'm not even I'd like to figure out how to, like maybe there's contributions that people who aren't writing the code necessarily, but are doing basic implementation can say, hey, or deployment, or even lab work could say, hey, here's what I did. And because there's lots of tutorials for lots of fun things on the internet, and maybe there's a place to check that in.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Any other questions, or am I out of time? 22 seconds. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.